Hey, how you doing? My video presentation is actually on rock music and the process of how it evolved from the time of its inception back in the 1950s to how it is today. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Rock music was actually invented by this man right here, Chuck Berry. He is credited with its invention back in the 1950s, and according to an article on eHow, he was actually trying to come up with a country song, and he ended up fusing country music with rhythm and blues, and what was born out of that was actually rock and roll. So, also during that time in the 1950s, after him came this man right here, Elvis Presley. He popularized the genre, and he's actually known as the king of rock and roll, and he actually uses a lot of country elements in his music. If you ever listen to him, you can actually clearly hear that country elements in there. And during the 1960s, it was actually dominated by two groups. One was Yardbirds, one was the British Invasion, the other was psychedelic rock. Now, the British Invasion consisted of bands from England who actually dominated the mainstream all around the world. And some of these bands include the Yardbirds, the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, and the Beatles. Now, the Beatles are actually credited with being the greatest musical group of all time, and that is actually from a special on VH1 that was titled "The 100 Greatest Artists of All Time." They were actually at the top of the list. So the other was psychedelic rock, which was bands like the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and the Mamas and the Papas. Yes, very weird names, but they made some incredible music. And one of those from that musical group was actually Jimi Hendrix, who is credited with being the greatest guitarist of all time. Now, from the 70s came about glam rock and hard rock heavy metal. And glam rock was actually girly stuff in which the men wore a whole bunch of makeup and tight clothing. And David Bowie actually saw him perform. I thought he was a woman when I first heard him perform. The other one was Kiss. They were two of the popular glam metal acts at that time. And Kiss again wore a whole bunch of makeup and a whole bunch of tight clothing and had very weird antics on stage. Now, heavy metal was actually a lot more aggressive stuff. These were bands like Aerosmith, Judas Priest, Motorhead, and AC/DC. During this time, heavy metal actually was born out of bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. Many people think it was Led Zeppelin who invented it. I personally think it was Black Sabbath. During the 80s, heavy metal actually became a lot more aggressive. These bands were influenced by Van Halen and a whole bunch of other bands from the 70s. It was bands like Iron Maiden and Def Leppard. Also during this time, the Big Four came out, the Big Four of thrash metal. These were bands like Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, and Metallica. And if you're a fan of metal music, you have to be a fan of Metallica. It's like a rule. You have to be. And during this time also came on glam metal, which was again influenced by the glam rock acts of the 70s. They wore a whole bunch of tight clothing, a whole bunch of makeup, and now had big hair. And these were bands like Motley Crue, Rat, Bon Jovi, and during the later part was Guns N' Roses. Now, Guns N' Roses actually made it a little bit more aggressive than their predecessors. Now, during the 90s, was actually dominated by grunge and post-grunge. And during the early 90s, which was around the time I was born, it was dominated by bands like Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, and Nirvana. Nirvana was probably the most popular, and it was their album Nevermind that took the world by storm, basically. After them came post-grunge with bands like Collective Soul, Creed, and the most popular, the Foo Fighters. Now remember that band because I'm going to mention them a little bit later on in the presentation. And then during the 2000s decade came about post-hardcore with bands like 3 Days Grace and Avenged Sevenfold. And also pop punk had a revival with bands like Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, the All-American Rejects, and Simple Plan. And also some girls actually came about with this genre of music with bands like Paramore and the singer Avril Lavigne, which is actually my favorite female singer. And just recently, the Foo Fighters took home a whole bunch of Grammy Awards at these past Grammy Awards. So they're basically taking rock music back from where it was at before them. So this has been my presentation on rock music. I hope it was informative. So yeah, thank you.